The thought of protests in a country like China are unthinkable. It's not a thriving democracy like ours. Protests are rare and they're squashed by the local police and government very, very quickly. But the anger of the people has grown to the extent that protests became uncontrollable over the weekend. Now, there were protests that broke out in at least 6 Chinese cities, universities, including in Beijing and Shanghai. Now, on Monday, when those protesters tried to assemble again, there was a crackdown. The Chinese police have not allowed protests to happen, and there are reports that the police are actually calling and tracking down people who attended some of these protest marches. It is the biggest challenge that Xi Jinping has faced so far. What is happening and why has all of this begun? Let me start with the timeline. On Thursday last week, a fire broke out in the Urumqi district of Western China. In this fire, 10 people died. Now, a lot of people believe that these 10 people who died was because they could not escape the building and the compound due to stringent COVID lockdowns. Remember, China is pretty much the only country in the world that still follows a zero COVID policy, and this includes very, very strict COVID lockdowns. The average Chinese people believe that because of these lockdowns, those 10 people could not escape in time and died in the fire. This is something Chinese authorities have, of course, denied. That was the spark, in a sense, that has ignited this sea of protests in a people who have honestly lost patience. It's been 3 years since the COVID-19 pandemic, and the level of stringent COVID policies in China have not eased at all, because Xi Jinping believes in a zero COVID policy. Now, what exactly is a zero COVID policy? A zero COVID policy means there is no tolerance to any COVID cases on a daily basis. Remember when we used to have these daily updates on the number of new COVID cases per day? Well, in China, the aim of the state is that there should be zero COVID cases being added on a daily basis. To ensure this, they require extreme suppression of movement and very, very strict testing. They have systems where QR codes, something like our Arogya Setu, are required to let you get into any public place. And if that QR code flashes red instead of green, you are immediately stopped. There have been horror stories of families who are separated in public places, a stadium or a mall, because one member has tested positive for COVID while the others have not, and then they are separated and sent to state quarantine centers. There are places in China where people have not been able to leave their homes for over 100 days, and people are fed up. In the first couple of years, the people thought, the government knows best, they're keeping us safe. That patience is wearing thin. Now, on the other hand, while these protests are raging on, the number of COVID infections have actually gone to the highest level since the first breakout in China. They've clocked about 40,000 cases in a day. Why is this happening? It's also exposed the quality of the Chinese vaccine, the Sinovac. It seems to be less effective than a Moderna or a Pfizer or any of the other vaccines that have been used internationally. Also, they have not managed to vaccinate their elderly to the same extent, so their population is more open to COVID infections. Another factor that is contributing to this is because of such stringent and intense lockdowns, the people have not managed to get herd immunity. They've been exposed very less to the infection. That means any new strains show up in a more aggressive fashion, spread more aggressively, and lead to greater sickness and illness. They have the same concerns that their hospitals will be overwhelmed. But they have not managed to normalize and live with COVID-19 like most of the world did. This is something that Xi Jinping is hung up on. When he took over his third term just recently, he announced that he will not relent on zero COVID, and the people are beginning to now speak out. In fact, some of these protests are not just about easing COVID. They've also been asking for Xi Jinping to step down. Again, unthinkable and unheard of in China. Now, the question is, what is the rest of the world saying and doing? British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was very clear that the way these protests are being handled by the Chinese government is unacceptable. He was speaking specifically about an incident where a BBC reporter was arrested and then held, even assaulted for several hours. So he said that was unacceptable. They were going to take it up. The US has also responded. The IMF has also responded, saying that the way the Chinese government and police are cracking down on protesters is not right. So there is a lot of global scrutiny right now on how China actually handles these protests. In typical Chinese fashion, if one would say, the way they are doing this is by overwhelming people in China with information that is positive. They're trying to talk to them about Chinese space exploration. They're trying to tell them positive stories. Of course, all social media is pretty much banned and very, very closely censored. There are some reports that they were actually editing out footage of people in the stands of the World Cup, the Football World Cup going on in Qatar right now, so that the Chinese public cannot see those without masks and get even angrier that the rest of the world has moved on from COVID-19 while they haven't. Well, while all of these stories emerge, there is no doubt of the fact that the Chinese government has to find a way to quickly ease these angry outbursts among the people, maybe step back a little on their zero COVID policies and make sure the lives of the people are not a living hell just because they want to avoid more COVID infections.
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to Mirror Now.